My lawyer father once told his partners I was a mistake. My sister is marrying the soldier I pulled from a burning Humvee in Iraq. She has no idea, but tonight at her wedding I won't arrive as their mistake. I will arrive as the consequence they never prepared for. My name is Captain Daisy Flynn. I'm 33 years old, and for the last 15 years I have lived a life defined by honor, discipline, and the quiet dignity of service. The October afternoon in Arlington, Virginia, carried a crispness in the air that signaled a true autumn. From the edge of the parade ground at Fort Myer, I watched the soldiers of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, move through their drills with flawless precision. Every unified crack of boot heels on the pavement, every snap of a rifle brought to the shoulder was a note in a symphony of order. This was my world, a universe constructed from honor, where every individual was an essential link in a sacred chain of duty. Here, your name and your actions were one and the same. Back in my small, tidy apartment, the sense of calm was immediate. My space was a sanctuary, with a clear view of the Iwo Jima Memorial, its silent figures a constant reminder of sacrifice and will. I went through the simple ritual of making a cup of Earl Grey tea, the scent of bergamot a familiar comfort. I breathed in the quiet. This peace wasn't a gift, it was a spoil of war, a trophy I had earned after fighting demons overseas, and more privately, the ghosts of my own past. This tranquility was a fortress, and I had built it one painful brick at a time. Then I saw it. On the small wooden table by the door, sitting amongst a neat stack of bills and official Army correspondence, was an ivory-colored envelope. It seemed to radiate a foreign energy, jarringly out of place. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I recognized it instantly, the heavy, expensive Conqueror cardstock my mother, Eleanor, favored for her most important social announcements. It was a statement of status before a single word was read. There was no return address. Of course not. It wasn't mail, it was a summons. My hands felt unsteady as I picked it up. Inside was a wedding invitation for my sister Claire. Her radiant, professionally photographed smile beamed up at me, her arm linked with a handsome fiancé. They looked like a perfect couple from a polished world that had never truly been mine. But my breath caught when my eyes scanned down to the groom's name. Printed in an elegant script, Michael Sullivan. It couldn't be. The name shattered the peace of my apartment. Suddenly, I wasn't in Arlington. The scent of bergamot was replaced by the acrid, unforgettable smell of burning fuel and charred flesh. The gentle hum of the refrigerator became the high-pitched shriek of tortured metal. The memory slammed into me with physical force, not of a wedding chapel, but of the Iraqi desert, of a young private's face, caked in blood and dust, his eyes wide with terror. My hand began to tremble, the expensive invitation nearly slipping from my grasp. Michael Sullivan. The man I had pulled from a flaming Humvee. How in God's name had they found him, and why? The questions echoed in the roaring silence of my mind. I forced my eyes back to the invitation, flipping it over. The phrase, "We would be so delighted to have you there," was embossed in shimmering gold ink, a polite, hollow sentiment. But it was the handwritten line below it, on the space for the guest's name, that made the blood freeze in my veins. It didn't say Daisy Flynn. It said, in my mother's elegant, looping cursive, Daisy Flynn. A single letter. A single deliberate misspelling. It wasn't a mistake. Not from my mother, a woman for whom details were everything. A misplaced fork at a dinner party was a cardinal sin. This was an act of surgical cruelty, a message delivered with the precision of a sniper. It said, "You are an afterthought. You are an inconvenience we are forced to acknowledge. You are a detail so unimportant that we can't even be bothered to get your name right." It was a subtle, dismissive gesture you could never prove was intentional, leaving you to bleed out alone. Why? The word was a raw whisper, swallowed by the silence. My mind was reeling, trying to connect the impossibly cruel dots. Why Michael, of all people? Why invite me, only to deliver this soul-crushing insult? As I stood there, the weight of 2 decades of such moments pressed down on me. I closed my eyes, my knuckles white as I gripped the invitation. The words of the Serenity Prayer, a mantra I'd learned to lean on, began to form in my mind, a desperate attempt to find an anchor in the storm. God, grant me the serenity. But another voice cut through it, louder and colder. It was the voice of my father, the powerful D.C. lawyer, from a cocktail party years ago. He had been speaking to one of his partners, thinking I was out of earshot. His words, spoken with casual, dismissive certainty, echoed in my head as if he were standing right beside me. "This girl," he had said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. This girl was a mistake. The heavy cardstock in my hand felt less like an invitation and more like an admission ticket. A ticket back to a place I had spent my entire adult life trying to escape. The personal, curated museum of my own pain. Each memory was a carefully preserved exhibit, a testament to a long and systematic campaign of quiet dismissals and polite cruelties. It wasn't one single dramatic act of betrayal that defined my family. It was the death by 1,000 cuts, the slow, steady erosion of self-worth that only those closest to you can inflict. The first exhibit that came to mind was from when I was 24. I was a young lieutenant then, granted special leave to attend a gala at the Kennedy Center, where my father was being honored by his law firm. I remember feeling a surge of pride, a naive hope that this time they might finally see me. I wore my Army service uniform, the Class A dress blues, pressed to perfection. The dark fabric, the gleaming brass, the crisp white shirt. It was more than a uniform to me. It was the embodiment of my choices, my sacrifices, my entire identity. That evening, a photographer captured a beautiful family portrait on the grand staircase. My father beaming, my mother the picture of social grace, my sister Claire sparkling in a designer dress, and me standing tall and proud beside them. A few weeks later, my mother posted the photo on her Facebook page, but I wasn't in it. She had physically cropped me out of the frame. The edit was clumsy, leaving a strange, empty space next to Claire, a ghostly void where I was supposed to be. When I finally found the courage to call and ask why, she had sighed, a long, weary sound as if I were a particularly difficult child. "Oh, Daisy, honey," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "That uniform, it's just so rigid. It didn't fit the elegant atmosphere of the evening, you understand." She didn't understand, or refuse to, that the uniform she found so distasteful represented everything I had given up to earn it. It stood for the holidays I'd missed, the friendships that had faded, the physical and emotional toll of a path she and my father had always considered a profound disappointment. To her, I wasn't a daughter serving her country. I was a fashion faux pas, a disruption to her perfectly curated image of the flawless Flynn family. Then there was the second exhibit, the silent medal. I was in Iraq when I was awarded my first Bronze Star with the V device for valor. I didn't do it for the recognition, but when the official orders came through, I sent a copy home. It wasn't to brag, it was a simple, desperate message. I'm okay. I'm doing my job well. Please be proud of me. The silence that followed was deafening. No congratulatory phone call, not a single email, nothing. Months later, on a short leave, I was looking for a book. In my father's home office, a sprawling room lined with mahogany and leather-bound law volumes. By chance, I noticed a stack of legal journals on a side table. Tucked behind them, half hidden, was the manila envelope I had sent from my APO address. It was still sealed. My heart didn't just break. It felt like it shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. My valor, my survival, my accomplishment. It wasn't even worth the effort of opening an envelope. My existence was a piece of junk mail to be filed away and forgotten. The cruelty of it was magnified by what I saw just moments later. There, taking pride of place on the marble mantelpiece above the fireplace, was a new addition. It was a gaudy gold-plated frame holding a certificate for Claire, Employee of the Month, from the marketing firm where she worked. Her minor office achievement was celebrated, displayed for all to see, while my medal, earned in the face of death, lay unopened in the shadows. The message was clear. Her world was real and important. Mine was an abstraction, a source of inconvenience and mild embarrassment. In that vast desert of indifference, there was only one oasis: my grandfather, Arthur Flynn. He was a World War II veteran, a man of few words, but with eyes that saw everything. He didn't speak in grand pronouncements, but he looked at me. He truly saw me. When I graduated from West Point, he was the only one who came. My parents attended, of course, their applause polite but distant, their smiles strained. They were there to fulfill an obligation. But Grandpa Arthur, he was there for me. He wrapped me in a fierce hug, his old tweed jacket, smelling of pipe tobacco and integrity. He whispered in my ear, his voice rough with emotion. "They don't understand honor, my girl, but I do. I understand." He passed away while I was deployed in Afghanistan. The news didn't reach me for a full week. When I finally got through to Claire, her voice was detached. "It was just a small private family service, Daisy," she'd said. "We didn't want to bother you." A private service. I later found out through a family friend that the private service had been a massive memorial at the Washington National Cathedral, attended by hundreds of people, judges, politicians, and community leaders. They hadn't just mourned him. They had erased me from the final chapter of the one person who had ever truly loved me. They had denied me the right to say goodbye. Standing in my apartment, the invitations still clutched in my hand, I felt the weight of that final, unforgivable act. He had been my anchor, the one person who validated my choices. His belief in me was the foundation I had built my life on. And I have to wonder, have you ever had that one person? The one who saw you when no one else did, and whose memory you fight to honor, even when the world tries to make you forget? My grandfather had left me with a legacy of honor. My family had tried to bury it. They didn't understand that honor wasn't something you could put in a frame or crop out of a photograph. It was something forged in fire, something you carry in your soul. And I couldn't help but wonder what had become of the true legacy he'd left behind. My grandfather said he understood honor. My family didn't. They saw my life as a series of questionable choices, a deviation from the respectable path they'd laid out. They saw a uniform, but they never saw the person inside it. They never saw the moments that defined what honor truly costs. They never saw Fallujah. The memory isn't hazy. It's seared into my mind with perfect, brutal clarity. The air temperature was 120 degrees. but inside the cramped confines of the Humvee, it was a furnace. The fine, talcum powder-like dust of the Iraqi desert coated everything, getting into your teeth, your lungs, your soul. We were on a routine patrol through a narrow market street when hell opened its gates. There was no warning, just a deafening, concussive blast that ripped the air apart, followed by a rain of superheated metal. The lead vehicle in our convoy, carrying 3 of my men, was hit by an IED. It was thrown onto its side, instantly transformed into a mangled, burning cage. The screams of the men inside were drowned out by the sudden sharp crackle of AK-47 fire erupting from the rooftops around us. It was a classic ambush, the kill zone. My radio crackled to life, the voice of command from the Tactical Operations Center, miles away in an air-conditioned tent, barking in my ear. Alpha 6, hold your position, wait for air support. I saw the flames. I saw them licking at the vehicle's fuel tank, a river of fire crawling toward a catastrophic end. Air support was minutes away. My men had seconds. Waiting was a death sentence, and I couldn't do it. The officer's oath I took wasn't a suggestion. It was a blood pact. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Covering fire now, I screamed into my own radio, the order directed at the rest of my platoon. Then I was out, launching myself from my own vehicle, my body hitting the scorching hot pavement. I pressed myself as low as I could, the ground like a frying pan against my gear. Bullets zipped past my head with a vicious hiss, kicking up puffs of dust around me. Every foot of ground I gained was a gamble with death, a prayer whispered between gritted teeth. I reached the burning wreck, the heat so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin from my face. Through the thick, black, choking smoke, I saw an arm, reaching out weakly from the twisted frame. It was Sergeant Peters. I grabbed him, adrenaline surging through me, and pulled with everything I had. His body was a dead weight, his groans barely audible, over the roar of the fire and the unending gunfire. I dragged him behind the crumbling corner of a nearby wall. A pathetic excuse for cover, and then I turned back. There were 2 more men inside. I had to go back. The flames were inside the cabin now. I was running out of time. On my 3rd trip into that inferno, I was nearly overcome by the smoke, my lungs burning. I saw a young soldier, his leg pinned beneath the mangled dashboard. His eyes were wide with a silent, primal terror, his body too weak to even scream. It was Private Michael Sullivan. I knew him. He was the kid who wrote letters to his high school sweetheart back home every chance he got, his handwriting neat and hopeful. There was no time to think. I used the butt of my rifle, smashing it against the warped metal pinning his leg. A piece of jagged, glowing hot shrapnel flew off, searing a line across the back of my hand. A guttural roar of pain escaped my lips, but I ignored the searing agony. I hooked my arms under his shoulders and pulled. Using the last ounce of strength I possessed, I dragged him clear just as a secondary explosion, likely the fuel tank, erupted behind us, blowing the rest of the Humvee into a fireball of oblivion. He was unconscious in my arms, but he was breathing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. I fumbled for the dog tags around his neck, my burned hand screaming in protest. I closed my fist around the cool metal, the embossed letters of his name pressing into my palm. I made a silent promise to the unconscious boy in my arms, a promise that he would see his home again. Now, standing in my quiet Arlington apartment, I looked down at my hands. The one that held the pristine ivory invitation was unblemished, but I could still feel the phantom heat, the ghost of that burn on my right hand. The scar had faded over the years, but the memory was branded onto my soul. This was the honor my grandfather saw. This was the value my family could never comprehend. It wasn't found in a gala at the Kennedy Center. It was found in the dust and the blood, in the choice to run toward the fire when every instinct screamed to run away. How do you find peace after walking through hell? You find it with the people who walked through it with you. The next morning, before the sun had fully burned through the early mist, I found myself at Arlington National Cemetery. I needed to be there. I needed to recalibrate my soul, to wash away the toxic residue of the invitation. I stood and watched the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The sentinel moved with the precision of a finely calibrated machine. 21 steps. He would stop, turn, and face the tomb for 21 seconds. Another 21 steps. The clicks of his heels were the only sound in the reverent silence. As I watched, I silently recited the Sentinel's Creed, words I had memorized long ago. It's a vow of perfection, of unrelenting discipline and selfless dedication. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. Though I may be cold, I will never be cold-hearted. Here, on these hallowed grounds, there was no room for carelessness, no tolerance for selfishness. Here, everyone understood the profound weight of the uniform they wore. My family in Potomac, Maryland, saw my uniform as an awkward accessory. Here, it was a sacred trust. This was my true family, a family bound not by blood, but by a shared oath. A family defined by absolute respect for those who had fallen and for each other. The tranquility I felt in that place was a balm on my fractured spirit, a quiet affirmation that I was part of something larger and more meaningful than my own personal pain. After the ceremony concluded, Sergeant First Class Williams, a lifer with 20 years of service, etched into the lines on his face, came to stand beside me. He didn't look at me directly, but instead gazed out at the endless, perfectly aligned rows of white headstones that stretched across the rolling hills. "You're carrying something heavy, Captain," he said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Family stuff, Sergeant." He gave a slow, understanding nod. He didn't ask for details. He didn't pry. In his quiet acknowledgement, there was more comfort than in 1,000 empty platitudes. He simply recognized the burden. We stood in silence for a long moment, watching a lone groundskeeper tend to a patch of grass in the distance. "Sometimes," he finally said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, "the hardest battle isn't out there, it's at home." That was it. That was all he needed to say. In that moment, I didn't need to explain the invisible scars, the years of feeling like a ghost in my own home. He knew, they all knew, in their own way. The silent understanding that passed between us was more profound than any conversation I'd ever had with my own father. Later that day, I found more of that quiet strength in the most mundane of places. The mess hall at Fort Myer. I sat at a long table with a few junior officers, fresh-faced lieutenants just starting their careers. They were talking about the challenges of their training courses, their anxieties about upcoming assignments. When I offered a few words of advice based on my own experiences, they fell silent. They listened, their expressions intent, absorbing every word. No one interrupted. No one dismissed my perspective. They weren't just being polite. They were showing genuine respect for the rank on my collar and the experience it represented. After lunch, a young private approached me, his posture ramrod straight. "Excuse me, Captain," he said, his voice filled with sincere deference. "I had a question about uniform regulations for the upcoming ceremony, ma'am." It was these small things, the respectful ma'am, the thoughtful nod from a sergeant, the attentive silence of my junior officers. These were the bricks that built my fortress. They were constant, quiet reminders of who I was and where my value lay. My worth wasn't determined in a Potomac mansion or at a DC gala. It was forged here, in a world of shared duty and mutual respect. This was the world that held me together, even as the other world, my family's world, seemed determined to tear me apart. Sergeant Williams's words echoed in my mind. The hardest battle is at home. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread and resolve, that I was about to walk onto that battlefield. A few days after the invitation arrived, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with my mother's name, accompanied by a Vivaldi ringtone she'd insisted I set for her years ago. It always felt like a performance. I let the final ornate notes fade, took a deep, fortifying breath, and answered, preparing myself for the inevitable emotional gymnastics. "Daisy, honey." Eleanor's voice was a cascade of practiced sweetness, a warm, buttery tone she reserved for public appearances and difficult phone calls. It was the voice of a woman who hadn't spoken to her daughter in months, but wanted to sound as if they'd just chatted yesterday. "I'm so glad you got the invitation. We were just saying at the club how much we're all looking forward to seeing you. It's been too long." I remained silent. A tactic I'd learned was more effective than arguing. Her cheerfulness was a weapon designed to disarm, to make any resistance on my part seem churlish and ungrateful. She continued, seamlessly shifting her tone into one of feigned concern, a specialty of hers. "Now the wedding is going to be quite a formal affair, you know. It's at the Congressional Country Club, with so many of your father's important partners from K Street. It's a very important crowd. I just want to make sure you'll be comfortable." I knew exactly what comfortable meant in her vocabulary. It was a code word, polished to a high shine by years of use. It meant invisible. It meant uncomplicated. It meant don't be yourself. Don't be the daughter who chose a world of grit over a world of galas. Don't remind our powerful friends, the ones who judge success, by stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons, that a part of our perfect family is, in their eyes, so profoundly and disappointingly odd. Then, having laid the groundwork of false affection and vague warnings, she moved in for the kill. "And Daisy," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a precious, intimate secret just between the two of us. "About your work, I was thinking, it might be best if you don't talk too much about the Army. You know how it is, darling. It can be a little heavy for a festive atmosphere, a bit intense for a celebration." I felt a cold rage begin to build deep in my gut, a slow rising tide of nausea and fury. The casual way she said the Army, as if it were a mildly embarrassing hobby, like collecting porcelain dolls. But I kept my own voice perfectly even, my breathing steady. She wasn't finished. This was just the opening salvo. "Perhaps," she went on, the suggestion slick with manipulation, her voice now oozing with helpfulness, "you could just say you're doing strategic security consulting for a private corporation? Something like that. It sounds so much more civilian, more chic. It would be easier for your father's friends to understand, don't you think?" The blood in my veins turned to ice. This was a new low, even for her. This was more than just a request for silence. She was asking me to lie. She was asking me to actively participate in my own erasure. She wanted me to fabricate a palatable, corporate-friendly identity, to protect their fragile social standing. She was asking me to disavow 15 years of service, to dishonor the soldiers who had fallen beside me, to negate the very oath I had sworn to uphold. All so their affluent guests wouldn't feel a moment of awkwardness. It was the ultimate insult, delivered with the loving concern of the mother who had given me life, and then spent it trying to reshape me. But I didn't scream. I didn't argue. Years of training as an officer had taught me that in any confrontation, the person who maintains composure holds the power. The fury inside me was a white-hot forge, but my voice, when I finally spoke, was as cold and sharp as shrapnel. "I will wear something appropriate, Mother," I said, each word deliberate and measured. "And I will be myself, Captain Daisy Flynn, United States Army." A stunned, crackling silence met my words. I had broken the unspoken rules. I had refused to be managed. Finally, Eleanor let out a long, theatrical sigh, the sound of a wounded matriarch. "Well, all right, Daisy," she said, her voice laced with disappointment. "Have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you." She hung up, but the warning had come too late. A war had been declared, and I had just accepted the terms of engagement. I walked to my closet. My dress blues and my camouflage ACUs hung there, symbols of my honor and my struggle. They were my truth, but for this battle, I needed different armor. My eyes bypassed them. They were what my family expected, a confirmation of their belief that I was rigid. No. My hand reached past them, settling on a perfectly tailored dark navy pantsuit from Theory. It wasn't the soft dress my mother wanted, nor the uniform she despised. It was a statement of power, professionalism, and unassailable control. I wouldn't be playing their game. I would be playing my own. After the call ended, I didn't throw the phone. I didn't slam a fist against the wall. I didn't cry. I simply stood motionless in the center of my living room, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. But inside, a storm had finally broken. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of a sudden squall. It was a cold fury, a focused, glacial force that had been building for 33 years. It was the moment a soldier stops being defensive and starts planning an offensive. My mother's words were the spark, but my father's were the fuel. A memory I had long suppressed surfaced with chilling clarity. It was a Christmas party at their Potomac home. The air smelled of pine needles and expensive perfume. I had just come downstairs when I overheard my father speaking to one of his partners, his voice low but carrying in the festive quiet. He thought I couldn't hear. "Investing in Claire is investing in the future," he'd said with a self-satisfied chuckle. "Investing in Daisy, well, that's a charity case." A charity case. The phrase hit me now with the force of a physical blow. 15 years of service, multiple deployments, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the friends I had lost, the life I had saved, all of it, in his world, amounted to nothing more than a tax write-off. An act of pity. The final fragile dam of my restraint, built over a lifetime of such dismissals, crumbled into dust. The last straw had been laid, and the back of the camel was broken. My silence, my long-suffering endurance, was over. They wanted me to be an invisible guest at their perfect wedding. Fine, I would attend. But I would not be invisible. I would be a mirror, reflecting their own ugliness back at them in a way they could not ignore. There's a quote by General George S. Patton I've always held on to. "Measure a man not by the position he has reached in life, but by the obstacles he has overcome." My family only ever saw the position. They never acknowledged the obstacles. Tonight, I would make them see. I walked with purpose to my closet. My hand brushed past my army service uniform, the deep blue fabric a symbol of my public self. It passed over my camouflage ACUs, the uniform of my raw, unfiltered reality. They were my identity, my pride. But I knew with a strategist's clarity that wearing them to the wedding would only feed their narrative. It would confirm their prejudice that I was rigid, inappropriate, an outsider who didn't understand their world. No, my weapon for this battle had to be more sophisticated. It had to be something from their own world turned against them. My fingers found it, a dark navy blue pantsuit from Theory, impeccably tailored. It was neither the soft feminine dress my mother would approve of, nor the uniform she despised. It was a statement of a different kind. It was armor forged in the corporate fires of power and control they so admired. It spoke a language of authority they understood, success, professionalism, and a quiet, unassailable confidence. I wouldn't be attending as the discarded daughter. I would arrive as a field-grade officer, a leader, a woman who could no longer be dismissed or underestimated. I would play their game, but this time it would be by my rules. Standing before the full-length mirror, the sharp lines of the suit jacket settling on my shoulders, I knew that the uniform was only part of the strategy. A good commander never goes into battle with just one weapon. I needed an ally. I needed leverage. I needed an asset they could never anticipate. An image of my grandfather, Arthur, flashed in my mind. The memory of his voice, rough but kind. He always told me, when powerful men use the rules to oppress, you use the rules to demand justice. He believed in the system, but he also believed in fighting for your place within it. My heart began to beat faster, a steady, determined rhythm. I went to my old roll-top desk, the one he had left me, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound address book. My fingers flipped through the pages, past names of old friends and fallen comrades, searching for a name I hadn't contacted since that sham of a funeral. There it was, Alistair Finch, my grandfather's personal attorney, a man as old school and honorable as Arthur himself. Have you ever reached that point? That moment of absolute clarity when the fear is gone and all that's left is a cold, hard resolve to act. When you know you can't go back and the only way out is through. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady. I dialed the number. An older, formal voice answered on the second ring. Alistair Finch. Mr. Finch, I said, my voice as firm and clear as if I were issuing a command. This is Daisy Flynn, Arthur's granddaughter. There was a brief pause on the line, a moment of recognition. I believe my grandfather left some things in your care for me, I continued, my gaze fixed on my own reflection in the mirror. And I think it's time I claimed them. In military strategy, there's a principle as old as warfare itself. Know your enemy, know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. For years, I had only known the pain they inflicted. Now I was finally preparing to know my own strength. The day after the call with my mother, I met Alistair Finch. We didn't meet in a sterile K Street office. Instead, he suggested a small coffee shop called Baked and Wired, tucked away in an alley in Georgetown. It was a place with exposed brick, the smell of fresh-baked pastries, and a quiet, unassuming atmosphere far from the polished world of my father. Mr. Finch explained that it had been a favorite spot of my grandfather's, a place where they could talk without being seen or overheard. Mr. Finch had aged since I'd last seen him at that awful funeral, his hair now completely white, but his eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He carried an old, scuffed leather briefcase that looked like it had seen as many battles as he had. He placed it on the small table between us and opened the brass latches with a decisive click. "Your grandfather was a visionary, Captain," he said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. "He was the first person in years, outside of the military, to address me by my rank. It felt like a drink of cool water after a long time in the desert. He was a brilliant man, and he knew his family." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "He didn't leave a standard will. A will can be contested, dragged through the courts for years. Your father would have relished that fight." "No, your grandfather was smarter. He established a living trust, ironclad, designed to avoid exactly that kind of spectacle." He slid a thick, bound portfolio across the table toward me. It was heavy in my hands. "These are copies of his directives. He anticipated a day like this might come, Daisy. A day when you would need something more substantial than words to claim your rightful place." That night, sleep was impossible. I sat at my kitchen table, a single lamp cutting through the darkness, and read. I read for hours, the legal jargon slowly melting away to reveal the true heart of the documents. This wasn't just a dry legal instrument. It was my grandfather's final testament, his last defiant act of love and recognition. It was a declaration of his values. He had written, with the help of Mr. Finch, in painstakingly clear and unambiguous language, that the control of the Flynn Legacy Foundation, a charitable trust worth millions that he had built over his lifetime, was not to be passed down based on bloodline alone. It was not a birthright. Instead, the chairmanship and controlling interest would be transferred to the heir who best exemplifies the core values of service, honor, and courage in the face of adversity. It was a direct quote: service, honor, courage. The very values my family had spent my entire life dismissing as naive and unprofitable. There was a special clause, an airtight provision, stating that in the event of any dispute, the final decision would rest with an independent 3-person committee to be chaired by Alistair Finch himself. Tears streamed down my face as I read that passage again and again. They weren't tears of greed or triumph over the money. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking validation. My grandfather had seen me, all those years from thousands of miles away. Through all the silence and neglect from my own parents, he had seen me for exactly who I was. This trust wasn't just about assets. It was his final message, a beacon lit for me across the years. It said, "I see you, I'm proud of you, your path was the right one." The day of the wedding arrived, not with a storm of anxiety, but with a strange and powerful calm. It was the feeling a soldier gets before a well-planned operation. When the reconnaissance is complete, the objective is clear, and the assets are in place. The outcome is never guaranteed, but you have done everything in your power to prepare. You are ready. I went about my preparations with meticulous care. I pressed my navy blue pantsuit until the creases were razor sharp. I polished my leather shoes to a mirror shine. I carefully placed the portfolio from Mr. Finch into a slim leather attaché case. It wasn't just a stack of papers. It was my weapon. It was my shield. It was my inheritance. As I got into my car, the quiet confidence remained. I drove through the familiar streets of Arlington, heading for the Key Bridge, the gateway from Virginia into the world of D.C., and beyond it, Maryland. As my car climbed the arc of the bridge, the Potomac River sprawling below, I didn't look back at my past with pain. I looked forward, toward the rolling green hills of Potomac, toward the exclusive country club where my family was celebrating a union built on a lie. I was no longer the discarded daughter returning in shame. I was a commander, moving into enemy territory. The battle was about to begin, and this time I wasn't fighting alone. My grandfather was riding in the passenger seat right beside me. They had seated me at table 12, in a grand ballroom designed to hold 300 people, glittering under the light of crystal chandeliers. Table 12 was the equivalent of social Siberia. It was tucked into a dim back corner, so close to the swinging double doors of the kitchen that I could periodically smell the sharp scent of garlic and burnt butter, a greasy working-class counterpoint to the towering scentless orchid centerpieces on every other table. From this vantage point, I was an afterthought, an obligation fulfilled and then hidden away. But it also gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage, a sniper's perch from which to observe the night's proceedings. I watched the parade of hypocrisy with the detached calm of a battlefield observer. My father, Richard Flynn, stood at the podium, a vision of tailored charm and practiced eloquence. He was in his element, holding the room in the palm of his hand. He praised Claire, his precious gem, the daughter who had made all the right choices, who had followed the prescribed path of a good private school, an Ivy League degree, and now a respectable marriage. He toasted Michael, a man he barely knew, calling him the son he'd always wished for. Throughout his entire speech, he never once glanced my way. I was a ghost at his feast. When my mother took the stage, she was even more polished. She spoke of family traditions and a proper foundation in life. Her words a thinly veiled criticism of my entire existence. The foundation she spoke of was one of wealth and social standing, not of character. I simply took a sip of ice water, my face a mask of neutrality I had perfected over years. I was not an audience member tonight. I was a soldier, waiting for the signal. My gaze drifted to the head table. Michael looked tense, his champagne flute untouched. His eyes, dark with an emotion I couldn't quite read, kept finding mine across the vast room. He knew what was coming, and he was waiting too. When the last of the saccharine speeches concluded, the wedding planner, with a strained smile, announced that the groom had a few words. Michael walked to the podium. He thanked everyone for coming, his voice steady. Then his entire demeanor shifted. The polite groom vanished, replaced by a man with a solemn purpose. The ambient chatter in the room faded as his new serious tone captured their attention. "Before my beautiful wife and I have our first dance," he began, his voice resonating with an unexpected authority, "there is a debt of honor that I must repay." His eyes left the crowd and locked directly onto mine. I felt it like a physical touch. 100 pairs of eyes followed his gaze, a wave of attention rippling across the room until it landed on the forgotten guest at the forgotten table. "There is someone in this room tonight," he said, his voice unwavering, "without whom I would not be standing here at all. Someone I owe my life to, and that person is Captain Daisy Flynn." A wave of stunned, absolute silence rolled across the ballroom. You could have heard a pin drop. At the head table, my mother's serene smile froze and then collapsed. My father looked as if he'd been struck, his mouth slightly agape. My sister Claire just looked bewildered, turning from Michael to our parents with wide, questioning eyes. Michael didn't embellish, he just told the truth. 8 years ago in Fallujah, he said, my vehicle was hit by an IED. I was trapped inside, and it was on fire. Captain Flynn, my commanding officer, ran through enemy fire to pull me out. He paused, letting the raw reality of his words sink into the comfortable atmosphere of the room. She dragged me from a burning Humvee while we were taking enemy fire. She saved my life. My father, recovering from his shock, scrambled to regain control. He grabbed the microphone at his table, forcing a brittle, hearty laugh. "My son-in-law," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "What a sense of humor, always the kidder." But no one laughed, not a single person. The silence that answered him was absolute, a heavy, damning judgment that left him exposed and foolish under the glittering chandeliers. Then Michael did something that sealed their fate. He stepped down from the stage. He walked past the head table, past his new bride, past my stunned parents, and didn't give them a single glance. He walked with a soldier's purpose across the dance floor, his path direct and unwavering, straight to table 12. He stopped directly in front of me. The entire room held its breath. And then, in the cavernous, ringing silence, Private Michael Sullivan clicked his heels together, straightened his back until it was a ramrod, and brought his hand up in a salute. It was a perfect, textbook military salute, sharp, crisp, and executed with a reverence that was more powerful than any speech. It was a gesture that contained a universe of gratitude, respect, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and the officer who brought him home. My own training took over, an instinct buried deep in my bones. I rose slowly to my feet, my back straight, and returned his salute with the same sharp precision. For a moment, that was it. Just the two of us, a silent island of military honor in a sea of civilian confusion. But then something extraordinary happened. From a table in the corner, an elderly man in a tuxedo, someone's grandfather perhaps, slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. With a frail but determined motion, he too raised his hand in a salute. Then another man, younger, with a telltale haircut, at a table near the front, stood up and did the same. And another, one by one, 5 men, veterans, guests my family had invited without ever knowing the depth of who they were, stood and saluted me. In that moment, under the collective gaze of hundreds of strangers, I was no longer the family's awkward secret. I was no longer the charity case. I was no longer Richard and Eleanor Flynn's mistake. I was Captain Daisy Flynn, United States Army. And for the first time in my life, in my own family's world, I was finally, unequivocally, seen. The salutes ended, but the profound silence in the ballroom remained. It was a thick, heavy quiet, filled with the unspoken shock and judgment of 300 people. Into that void, a new figure stepped forward. It was Alistair Finch. He walked calmly toward the stage, his old leather briefcase in hand, moving with an unhurried grace that commanded attention. He ascended the small steps to the podium where my father had stood just moments before, a place that now seemed like a defendant's stand. "If I may have your attention, please," Mr. Finch said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a clear, authoritative tone that cut through the tension like a blade. "My name is Alistair Finch. I was the personal attorney and legal counsel for the late Arthur Flynn." The mention of my grandfather's name was like a thunderclap in the silent room. At the head table, my father, Richard, went pale. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. He knew this man, and he knew what this man's presence signified. This was not part of the wedding program. Pursuant to the final directives within Arthur Flynn's living trust, Mr. Finch continued, his delivery as precise as a legal filing, his gaze sweeping across the stunned audience before settling on my father. The controlling interest and chairmanship of the Flynn Legacy Foundation is to be transferred to the heir who best exemplifies the core values of service, honor, and courage in the face of adversity. He paused, letting the weight of those words hang in the air, a final verdict delivered from beyond the grave. Every eye in the room was now locked on him, then darted between my father and me. Then Mr. Finch's eyes found mine, and he gave me a slow, respectful nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "it is my distinct honor to announce that the heir, according to the irrevocable will of Arthur Flynn, is his granddaughter, Captain Daisy Flynn." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a choked, strangled sound from the head table. My mother, Eleanor, looked as if she might faint, her hand flying to her chest as her carefully constructed world shattered around her. But it was my father who found his voice, sputtering with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "No, that's impossible," he stammered, half rising from his chair scraping loudly against the floor. She knows nothing about finance, about running a foundation. This is a mistake. Finch, what is the meaning of this?" Mr. Finch's gaze turned to my father, his expression as cold and hard as granite. "On the contrary, Richard," he replied, his voice unwavering. Arthur believed that integrity was far more important than financial experience. He felt that a person who understood sacrifice could learn finance, but a person who only understood finance could never learn honor. It appears he was right. The finality in his tone broke the spell. My sister, Claire, her face a mess of tears and ruined makeup, finally reacted. She scrambled from her chair, her expensive wedding dress tangling around her feet, and ran toward me, not with understanding, but with pure, selfish fury. "You ruined my wedding," she shrieked, her voice a shrill accusation that echoed in the quiet hall. "You ruined the most important day of my life. You did all of this just because you've always been jealous of me." I looked into my sister's eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt no pain from her words. The old sting was gone, replaced by a profound and weary pity. She was a child, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, unable to see beyond her own reflection even now. She couldn't comprehend a world where something other than her own happiness was the central focus. "No, Claire," I said softly, my voice calm and clear enough for only her to hear. "I didn't ruin anything. You ruined it yourself, with your own selfishness." My father was on his feet now, striding toward me, his lawyer's mask of intimidation firmly in place. "We'll sue," he hissed, his voice low and threatening, trying to create a private bubble of menace in the public space. "We'll challenge this trust. This is ludicrous. You won't get a penny." Mr. Finch simply offered a thin, pitying smile. "Good luck with that, Richard," he said calmly, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Arthur made his arrangements legally airtight for this very reason. You'll spend millions of your own money and accomplish nothing but making your lawyers rich." I looked at them one last time, my father sputtering with impotent rage, my mother pale and trembling with the loss of social standing, my sister weeping for her ruined party. They were no longer the giants who had cast such long, oppressive shadows over my life. In the harsh light of truth, they looked small, pathetic. They were hollow people, rattling around in a life of luxury, and the foundation of that life had just been pulled out from under them. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. My victory wasn't in their defeat, but in my own freedom. "This isn't revenge," I said, my voice steady, speaking to them, but also to myself. This is about restoring my grandfather's honor. And with that, I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the whispers, the lies, and the lifetime of pain. I walked toward Mr. Finch, who was waiting for me by the exit. Together, we walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of a hollow empire, a family that had finally been consumed by the flames of its own arrogance and deceit. The heavy ballroom doors swung shut behind me, the sound a final satisfying click, and for the first time, I was free. 6 months later, the world was a different place. Or perhaps I was. I no longer lived in the small Spartan apartment in Arlington. As the new chair of the foundation, I had moved into a historic townhouse in Old Town Alexandria, with a small brick patio that overlooked the calm, wide expanse of the Potomac River. The very first action I took upon assuming control of the Flynn Legacy Foundation was to redefine its legacy. The old mission, which funded the art galleries and social galas my parents favored, was dissolved. In its place, I redirected the full resources to establish the Arthur Flynn Honor Scholarship. It was a fund dedicated exclusively to the children and spouses of service members, with a special focus on those killed in action or permanently disabled. It was designed to give them the educational opportunities they deserved, free from the burden of financial worry. Every time I signed the approval for another scholarship, sending another kid to college, it felt less like administration and more like I was continuing my grandfather's story. He had always reminded me of a verse from the Bible, Matthew 5:16. "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds." This was my way of letting his light continue to shine. In an old wooden box my grandfather had made, I still kept a small bundle of letters. They were angry, painful letters I had written to my family over the years, but had never sent. This afternoon, I took the box out to the patio. In the crisp autumn air, I untied the ribbon and read them one last time. Not with the familiar rage, but with a quiet, detached understanding. I had once craved their validation so desperately. Now standing here, I finally understood that the only approval that ever truly mattered was my own. One by one, I dropped the letters into the small, crackling fire in the outdoor chimenea. The flames licked at the ink-stained pages, consuming the years of anguish and turning them to weightless gray ash. As the last wisp of smoke curled into the sky and vanished, I felt no sense of loss. I felt light. I had finally forgiven, not them. I had forgiven myself for allowing their definition of me to hold me captive for so long. Michael and I still talk from time to time. He didn't stay with Claire. He called me a few weeks after the wedding, his voice heavy, and said he couldn't build a life on a foundation of lies. He's working now for a nonprofit in Virginia that helps veterans transition back to civilian life. Sometimes he'll stop by on a Sunday morning and we'll have coffee on the patio, talking about old comrades and new beginnings. There's no romance between us, just something deeper and far more resilient. A friendship forged in fire and cemented in truth. This morning, as the sun rose over the Potomac, painting the water in strokes of pink and gold, I stood on my patio and breathed in the cool, clean air. The fight was over. I was no longer a soldier on a battlefield. I was a gardener tending to a new legacy. My family had tried to bury me, to erase me, to dismiss me as a mistake. They didn't know that they had not been burying a casualty, but planting a seed. And now, in the quiet light of a new day, I was blooming. My story has found its dawn on the Potomac. but I know I'm not the only one who has fought this kind of battle in the shadows. So many of us carry silent wounds inflicted by the very people who were supposed to see us, to value us. If my journey has taught me anything, it's this: your worth is never defined by those who refuse to acknowledge it. It's defined by the honor, peace, and new life you build for yourself. If this story resonated with you, please know you are not alone. Share your thoughts below and subscribe to Chosen Revenge. To join a community that understands, your story matters.